With the surrender of Singapore in 1942, thousands of Allied troops became prisoners of the Japanese. From this huge force, a contingent of Australian and British POWs was sent to work at Sandakan Camp in North Borneo. The fate of these prisoners was to prove one of the grimmest of the war. While 150 officers were moved away to another camp, of the 2,400 prisoners remaining at Sandakan, only 6 men would survive to the end of the war. Today, only 3 of these men are still alive, survivors of a war crime they can never forget.
Now there are 2 down here in Sydney and 1 up in Brisbane. Now those 3 represent 2,000, what have you, men who were in Borneo when I left. And it took me years and years and years of ferreting out to find out the truth. And I still have not found out all the truth, because there are only 3 people alive today, and 2 of them are here, and these 2 will not be in Borneo when we go to Borneo.
If they had treated them, all those prisoners, those 2,000 odd Australians, properly and decent, they'd have all got home. So they were all murdered. Completely murdered, that was it.
On Anzac Day, you remember, you pay your respects. You come to a club, you stand up and you pay your respects. When they give the ode, you remember. What can you do? What more can you do? They're gone. They've been murdered, all of them, so...
I came home, they know me as I am now, and that's all they should know. Because I do think it would worry them if I actually told them the truth. And I don't want that.
In July 1995, a group of Australian veterans and their families on a pilgrimage to Borneo arrive at Sandakan. As the only survivor to return, Owen Campbell is the centre of media attention, expected to share his memories in public.
Okay, can we just do that again for the...
One of the survivors.
With his wife Evelyn, Owen visits the site of Sandakan prisoner of war camp, today a peaceful memorial park, where it is hard to imagine the horrors suffered here.
See, that's where your camp was, in there, behind there. It's all grown up now, see? You can just imagine what it was like. No roadways. The only road came out through down there and went down that way.
Sandakan camp was 8 miles inland from the coastal town of Sandakan itself. Here, the Japanese brought 2 groups of prisoners, a total of 2,000 Australians and 500 British, to build an airstrip for the Japanese war effort.
I'd say for the first 12 months we was at Sandakan. Sandakan was bearable.
The camp wasn't well organised. It wasn't escape-proof.
There was a band of us always outside of the night stealing food.
They did shoot one bloke going out one night.
After the escapes at night through the wire were finished, the diet was very deficient in vitamins.
You scrounge whatever you could get your hands onto, or if you get stuff from the natives. But if they saw him hand it to him with that poor bloke, they'd most likely take him away and shoot him. They had one intention, they wanted to kill you.
The construction of the airstrip at Sandakan was the immediate responsibility of Captain Shoichi Hoshijima. As commandant of the camp, Hoshijima was instructed to use his prisoners as forced labor on a military project, in direct breach of the Geneva Convention.
He was the commanding officer, and what he said was law. And he told us he didn't care if we died or not, we had to work till we finished the air run.
As an ambitious young lieutenant, Masaharu Yamada was attached to the headquarters of the Japanese army in Borneo. It was his idea to use POWs as forced labor. He supervised the transfer of prisoners from Singapore and planned the construction of the airstrip at Sandakan. Yamada and his fellow officers were to play a critical role in the fate of the prisoners.
とにかく健康な人が欲しいんだと。で、食料も十分に与えるから。で、我々としてはあくまでもとにかく下の力が欲しいんだと。機械は何もないんだしね。したがって、人数は2000人。できるだけ今の状態のいいところをぜひ回してもらいたい。
Jim Milner was one of 150 Australian officers who spent nearly 18 months at Sandakan before being suddenly moved to another camp.
Well, then the Japanese decided they had to meet their timetable, so they brought in a team of bashers.
If you got up to wipe their brow, you got to whack. And it's just, they'd like to stand at the whole party and beat them over the back with a big stick. It's back into work, you know.
But this didn't break the spirit in any way. In fact, just more or less the reverse. Made us despise them.
我々が着手したのは昭和17年のだいたい6月か8月頃からですね。それから行って昭和18年の初めにはもう直境機がどんどん降りておりましたし、1200メートルはきれいにできております。
The prisoners at Sandakan were at the mercy of Japanese officers, and later about 100 Formosan guards. Formosa, now known as Taiwan, was a colony of Japan. Young Formosans were press ganged to serve as prison guards in the Japanese army.
結局この逆に軍隊へ入らなければ結局今度何と言いましょうか、もう結局非国民というようなことを言わされたもんですから、結局やむを得なしに入ったわけなんですよ。
The Japanese really detested them. If the Japanese, 4 or 5 Japanese was to sit down for a rest, the Formosan would have to sit over there with the dog.
全く少年兵と同じような訓練を受け、しかるにちょっと悪かったらやっぱりピンタあるいは竹ほうきでぶん殴られたり、あるいは団体制裁地ってそれこそ向かい合ってピンタを殴り合い。
No matter how big you was or little I was, and line them all up facing one another and fight. They'd be running along with a big stick made, a sword stick, and watching if you wasn't bashing one another properly.
And we all had to stand with our arms out in the sun without hats till people were dropping.
So I got stood up, we got my pair of wings, as we used to call it, with your arms outstretched and look at the sun for an hour and a half.
And stand there as long as they wanted you, looking into the sun.
The cruelest torture inflicted on the prisoners was confinement for long periods without adequate food or water in the punishment cage, a cramped wooden box on stilts.
You couldn't stand up, it was only about 4 foot high. And after the 3rd day, they give us our first drink of water. And they made us drink that much, and we were sick. And then on the 7th day, the 7th evening, they give us a meal, our first meal. And then it was half rations from then on. I was in there another time for 40 days. We was let out at 5 o'clock each evening, and we'd all run around behind the guardhouse and fight the dogs for their scraps. and we'd be fighting the dog over a bone. A cranky, savage dog, we'd be pulling the bone out of his mouth, and he'd be trying to snatch it back. We'd be slooping up their slops, because we was that hungry and desperate.
The end of 1942 and the start of 43 saw major defeats for the Japanese on land and sea. The beginning of a long, brutal war in the Pacific. Japan would continue its record of war crimes begun in China against civilians and prisoners of war. And on both sides, the fighting would become more vicious. A war without mercy and without rules. But in Borneo, the front line was still far away, and the Japanese remained firmly in control, despite an attempted uprising. In the township of Sandakan, Chinese, Malays, and a few Europeans had formed a small but defiant intelligence network.
At that time, most of the young men wished to help the Allied army because the Japanese is so cruel.
This local underground linked up with a group of officers inside the camp, led by Captain Lionel Matthews, and managed to smuggle supplies to the prisoners.
From the store there, when they're going back to camp, I give them. They just wrap it with the old cloth, dirty cloth, and go back to the camp.
However, an informant's tip-off to the Japanese secret police led to a series of arrests and the discovery of a hidden radio. After months of torture, Captain Matthews and 8 members of the local underground were executed. The Japanese ordered the sudden removal of nearly all the Australian officers from Sandakan.
And then to suddenly be whisked away without being able to say goodbye or even wave to them was absolutely horrendous. And you can imagine how how we felt after the war when we heard they'd all died.
Things start to tighten up then at Sandakan. The deaths start occurring.
We started to get rid of malaria and beriberi, and then they started to go downhill because they had no medical treatment to get over it.
There's nothing to eat when you went out to the drum, and when you come back, you got a little water, a bit of watery rice. It was cut down to nothing. They gradually cut the rice right out altogether. So we was living on tapioca root. So therefore, the men all was getting beriberi. The blood was turned to water. They started to die like flies.
During 1944, the Japanese in Borneo were cut off from their supply lines. The Emperor's southern armies, isolated by the Allied push north, held on grimly. Few prisoners were taken on either side. Hatred of the enemy had hardened into an attitude of kill or be killed. As the fighting approached Borneo and the Japanese grew more desperate, the prisoners at Sandakan would become expendable. From October on, Sandakan Aerodrome was heavily bombed by the American Air Force.
You could hear them coming in, the cloud, you know, in Borneo, and you'd hear the coming, and all of a sudden they just...
Yeah, well, that cheered us up. On October 44, the Americans come over and clean up the aerodrome, and then from then on, every day or second day, they'd come over and shoot up the aerodrome.
Every morning, you set your watch 8:15. They'd come over and bomb the place.
On the way over, they'd strafe the camp too. It was accidental, but they would.
They go through the drone, bomb the drone, come around, come through the camps.
In January 1945, all efforts to repair the airstrips were abandoned, and with no use for the prisoners, the Japanese stopped feeding them altogether. But there was one job left to do. To prepare for a possible invasion, Imperial headquarters in Tokyo issued orders to the staff officers in Kuching to move troops from one side of Borneo to the other. 500 prisoners from Sandakan would carry ammunition and equipment, escorted by the Yamamoto unit. The unit's deputy commander, Captain Shigeru Ino, led the first of 9 parties on the march.
私の預かった捕虜は一番最初の定団ですので、割合に健康な人たちが全部おりまして、特にこれは大変だというような捕虜はおりません。
An infantryman, Umanosuke Iwahara, also took part in the march, leaving with the 8th party of prisoners.
最初捕虜のその服装と、それからその時の体力というか健康状態というか、その時見た格好ですよね。まずこんな格好じゃとても私は航空なんか山へ入っていくからできんと思いましたね。
Major Harry Jackson was sent to Borneo in 1946 to find and reward local people who had helped the prisoners. He filmed the route of the death marches.
The terrain was very rough and considered to be some of the worst jungle country in the world. Over very steep rises and hills and very thick jungle.
At the end of January 1945, the first death march began. 470 prisoners, some barefoot and wearing little more than rags, set out on a jungle track from Sandakan to Ranau, a total distance of 165 miles.
Didn't know where we were going, didn't know what direction we were going in, never had a clue. The Japs on our march they were reasonable Japs. They never hit us, they never drove us along. But if you couldn't keep up, they'd shoot you. Well, we knew that.
途中で動けなくなったという捕虜にしろ、日本兵にしろ、両マスのあるところへ、置いて、で全開をしたら後で前進をしろというようなことで。置いてきたことはあります。
だけど置いてかれたら死んでしまうんだからね。だからついていくしかないんだから。もう捕虜の人たちも我々もですね、置いてかれたらダメなんですよね。そんな人を助ける余裕はありませんから。
Someone found this milling on the road, like a rock milling. And we thought, well, that can go in the stew. And when they served it out to us, it was the most bitterest meal I've had in my life, and I just could not eat it. And my little mate, the one I was in the cage with both times I used to go out the wire with, he started to cry. And he was a game little man, you know. And it broke my heart, you know, to see him cry. A meal we was looking forward to, you know. The next day, he was really sick and they set him up against a tree and shot him.
How many men died on the death march is not known, but it is thought that about half the prisoners who'd left Sandakan perished as a result of the march, and the rest would soon die.
And as I went along, quite often I'd think to myself, well, this is where they marched and this is where they came. We're following in the footsteps of the dead. And you'd say, well, here's a river where they probably stopped to have a drink. And it was hard to reconcile the fact that such dreadful things took place in such beautiful country.
And 19 days later, we came into this big area, Renau. There was natives there and a few shops and gardens and women and children. And we thought, well, this is going to be all right. Instead of that, it was just one big slaughterhouse. That's when they really got stuck into us, at Renau.
At Ranau, the Japanese made feeding their own troops a priority. This meant food was scarce for the local people and for the newly arrived prisoners. Even so, some locals, moved by the pitiful condition of these starving white men, risked punishment and even death to help them.
Yang beginilah ba itu, habis kadang-kadang song pijual sayur kan, terus sayur sayur pakis bah. Jadi limpas lah semua itu jipun, belakang itu orang putih lah. Jadi seorang ada bawa ubi kayu, yang sudah tahu sudah bila kalau tiada orang putih ada itu nasi lah, nasi bungkus, terus suri-suri kasih dia lah begitu.
The Labiu was only 9 years old when she first saw the prisoners.
Tantu-tantu lagi orang putih kerapalan. Yang ada juga begitu, ada juga yang sehat, ada yang sampai rapal itu.
So to stop in the camp was to die really. So the more working parties you could get on, even if you had malaria, get out on a working party. You had a chance of getting something to eat, and you had a chance of getting into a creek and washing yourself, and you was away from this horrible death camp.
The portion of the death track as shown here is just out of Ranau on the way to Paganatan, and that is the remains of a storehouse that the Jap had several along the death route. The prisoners of war carried rice from Ranau to Paganatan on their backs, and they died very, very rapidly.
And when I came back from the rice carrying party, they had kind of Cleary chained to a stake with a chain around his neck and a stake outside their guardhouse with no clothes on him. And he was there for about 12 days. And I used to come down and urinate on him and kick at him. And he had dysentery, he's laying in his own mess. And I'd throw the food down on the floor to him, on the dirt, and he'd pick it up and eat it like an animal. He was delirious and sick and dying. One of the Formosans came over and said, "You better go and get that man. He's dying, we think he's dying." So we went over and we picked Cleary up and washed him and wrapped him up in a blanket. And he just looked up at us and smiled and died.
At the end of May 1945, a heavy air and naval bombardment reduced the township of Sandakan to ruins. Captain Takakua, the new commandant, had received orders to move with all his prisoners to Ranau, no matter what their condition.
もうその頃の軍司令部から言えばもう捕虜どころではなくて実際足元に火がついてきたんで。
In a panic, Takakua burned down the camp, leaving nearly 300 stretcher cases out in the open to die. The rest, some 500 men, were led into the jungle. The second death march had begun.
Men started to drop out straight away.
A lot of them were suffering the after effects of malaria. You can just imagine how they were. I think nearly everybody had touch of beriberi.
We ran out of food, and all we was eating was little shoots of the fern shoots and bamboo shoots. Any little snails or anything that we seen, we put in and mixed with our bit of rice.
Grasshoppers. Fungus that grows on logs and that the birds eat. You watch the birds eat what they eat. Some nuts, berries and nuts on some trees or scrubs that you go past. If you cross a creek and there's any freshwater fish or little crabs in it, you grab them.
Which finally we ran out of food altogether. It was marching on nothing.
And every morning before you marched off from where you camped overnight, they used to ask you to bring all the sick men out and put them there. You get down the track a little bit and you'd hear the machine guns going off.
いわゆるその僕が生理違反に当たった時にね、こうやって扱ったその僕がいわゆる処分したその捕虜に対してね、 まあ結局もう本人がねもうそれ以上歩けないとただね結局死ぬ前に私はパンを食べたいとほんで持ってるビスケットいわゆる日本陸軍の携帯ビスケットがあるんですそれを結局まあ半分残ってたもんだからその半分の2人で分けて食べたんですそれ食べた後に結局まあ処分したわけなんです
When Allied planes swept over the column, Owen Campbell and 4 others took advantage of the confusion to make a break into the jungle.
We went straight down the bank, straight down like that. Slid down, rolled down, slid down, and hid down there in the long grass and logs until the Japs all went past and we moved off. One bloke got very crook, and I stayed with him. The other 3, they moved on. And I used to go down along the creek banks, stream banks, scrounging for these crabs and little fish and that. When I came back, he'd done himself. So he wouldn't be a burden. And I came across the other 3. And they're sitting there and they said, we're going to go down. Next time a boat comes along the waterway, we're going to go down. I said, you were warned never to go near boats on the water because there could be Japs. But no, when they heard the prow go up there, they run down yelling out the top of their voice. And of course, I yelled out, well, be careful. And I run down behind them. And when they got down the opening, the Japs stood up in the back of the boat with the machine gun and opened fire. They never got to come ashore to see whether they were dead or not. They just kept on going. So nothing I could do was on my own from then on.
After 10 days in the jungle, Owen Campbell was found robbing a fish trap by local tribespeople and taken to their village. There, the Dusun villagers tended the desperately weak Australian. Fortunately for Campbell, the village headman, Kulang, was in contact with Australian commando units, then operating in Borneo. These commandos arranged for Campbell to be transferred by seaplane to an American supply ship and returned to Australia.
It's something that, what would I say? It's like coming out of a tunnel into sunshine.
During their pilgrimage to Borneo in 1995, Australian veterans set out by coach to retrace the route of the 2 death marches, from Sandakan to Ranau, a journey which in 1945 had taken the prisoners between 19 and 26 days. At Ranau, a memorial service held at the site of Gunner Cleary's death in the Ranau camp gives friends, relatives and local people a chance to remember and to pay tribute to those who died, those who survived, and those who tried to help them.
One day there was 20 men and the next day there was 10. 2 weeks later there was 6. And then the second march arrived.
On July 7th, Keith Bottrell joined Nelson Short, Bill Moxham and Andy Anderson to escape the hell of Ranau. With some meagre provisions, they crept into the jungle at night and headed for the coast.
And we found this little native hut. And we decided to hide out in there during the day. It was well off the track.
We hear this crunch, crunch coming around the back of the hut, and behind it, it said somebody's coming. Right. And all of a sudden, a little bloke coming. He looked at him, basket on his back with bananas in it.
And he says, what are you doing in my hut?
Little did he know he's the head man of his tribe.
Barriger, seen here with Harry Jackson, took care of the 4 escapees, building them a shelter and bringing them food every day. Despite the danger of discovery, others from Barriger's village also helped.
Well, Kahingel was a little boy about 17. He's a couple of years younger than me. Because I was only 20 then, I turned 21. Now up there in that little hut. And our Kahingel knew where we were. And he used to bring us fruit. Nearly every day Kahingel would come and see us.
Wah, sinilah. Ini. Musim itu dikatakan susah juga, tetapi yang seada pada kami, pasal barang makan, itulah kami kasih sama dia. Jadi, dan selama dia di sini, begitu juga kami pelihara. Dan kadang-kadang juga dia sakit lah.
Andy Anderson's getting worse. He's getting very ill. Got dysentery. He got malaria.
And he just died there one night. And the next day, we buried him.
One of the natives had come to us with a message from the escapees, from Bill Moxham, and led us to where they were. They were trying to come to us, and we were led to where they were.
And all of a sudden we hear crunch, crunch, crunch. What's this? I thought, oh, to myself, I thought they must be taken to the Japs. Must be the Japs, you know. And all of a sudden I look up, and these big 6-footers, all in jungle green.
Nelson's a shortish fellow, and he was just so full of berry. Bloated, his face was bloated out, his arms were bloated, his stomach was bloated out. But he's still, sick and all as he was, he still had that bit of pride that he was an Australian.
And they said, there you go, boys. Look, have a cup of tea, have this, have some, sit down, Down goes the stretchers. And I don't know, but I thought, gee whiz, if ever I seen, I'll never forget that as long as I live. Big, lofty and them, and they said, well, it's all over for you, boys. You're on your way home. I said, gee. And Bottrell said he looked up, and he said he'd never seen a sight in all his life. Like big and lofty,
Oh, I saw this fellow just lying there, and I looked at him, and he looked up at me,
And I said, thanks, digger. And that's when a tear came to his eye.
Nelson Short, Keith Bottrell and Bill Moxham were looked after by the Australian commandos. Some weeks later, the 3 survivors were finally evacuated by air to Labuan Island and safety. Another Australian, Bombardier Richard Braithwaite, also managed to escape on the 2nd March. After 5 days without food, he was rescued by a local fisherman and eventually made contact with the American Navy. Warrant Officer William Stipwich was the last prisoner to escape. Stipwich, a jack of all trades, who'd been a cook for the Japanese at Ranau, was warned by a Formosan guard that his superiors were planning to massacre all the remaining prisoners. The man who rescued Stipwich was a Dusun tribesman called Godahill. Two days after Stipwich's escape, Captain Takakua, then in command at Ranau, issued his final orders. All the remaining 32 prisoners were to be disposed of. The sickest crawled or were dragged by guards to a gravesite where they were shot. Those able to walk were led into the jungle to be killed. The last 5 were taken along a path, asked to sit down, and then shot.
もう無理やりに連れて行ったぐらいです。 結局もうおそらく殺すのも結局まあ我々としては結局かわいそうだけれども、本人たちはもうむしろその方がかえって楽じゃないかと、そういうような気持ちにもなります。もう歩けないんです。歩けないものを結局無理やりに連れてったんですから、我々としては本当まあ命令だからどうにもならないことになるんです。
Back at Sandakan, as the war was fast drawing to its end, only 5 POWs were left alive in the burnt-out ruins of the camp that had originally held 2,500 men.
ちょっとジャングルかどっかなんていうかあんまり人の目にとどまないところへ連れて行って機関銃でもって全部一斉走者でもって殺し合って、それでその参拝後の中へ全部埋め込んだということは聞いてる。
On the last day of the war, the only prisoner left alive at Sandakan was beheaded by a Japanese junior officer. Since May 1945, 2 Australian divisions have been engaged in fierce battles to retake Borneo against an enemy that refused to admit defeat. Hailed as liberators by the local population and as long-awaited rescuers by the surviving POWs at Kuching, these troops arrived too late to save their comrades at Sandakan and Renau. All that was left to do was the grim task of finding and identifying the remains of the dead. At the end of the war, a series of war crimes trials was conducted by the Australian military to determine the responsibility of Japanese and Formosans for atrocities committed in Borneo. Captain Hoshijima, commandant at Sandakan camp, came to trial, charged with cruelty, starvation of POWs, denial of medical attention, and forcing sick men to work. His prosecutor was the young Australian barrister, Athol Moffat.
Today is the day, and if ever I am determined, it is today, to see the slaughter of those lads is avenged. I saw Hoshijima for the first time today. He smiles a lot in a hard, evil way. It was a very tense and difficult trial. It went on for days and days, and Hoshijima fought like a cornered tiger.
Found guilty on all charges, Hoshijima was sentenced to be hanged.
The reports are that Hoshijima was defiant until the end, and that when they were pinioning him, he bit the hand of the provo and drew blood. And then when he mounted the steps to the gallows, that he shouted, "Banzai, Banzai," and the provo, when he did the execution, said, "This is for what you did to the Aussies at Sandakan." Dreadful story.
The young Japanese officers who had taken part in the first death march did not escape the attention of the military tribunal. Captain Yamamoto and 9 of his officers were brought to trial on charges of murder and the forced marching of sick prisoners.
All the ones who were in Yamamoto's march, they all kept very tight. They all told the same story, even down to all these details of helping all the prisoners along and all the rest of it.
Captain Yamamoto and all 9 junior officers received the death sentence. After a retrial, Lieutenant Abe and Captain Yamamoto were executed, but the death sentences of the other officers were not confirmed. Shigeru Ino served 15 years in prison for his part in the first march. As an officer at Kuching, Masaharu Yamada never came to trial.
このもう両部隊長に任すより他に方法がないというそういう考え方ですから、あとは全然もうわからんです、全然。まあその方面の軍主令の責任者自体は私かもしれないんで。
The war crimes trials also left a bitter legacy for the hated Formosan guards of Sandakan, charged with war crimes committed under orders from the Japanese. Karashima and Kiyoshima both served sentences of 15 years. Unable to return home to Taiwan, they still live in Japan today as second-class citizens. In the euphoria of peace, returning prisoners were given a hero's welcome. Over the next 50 years, the nation would turn the shame and bitterness of captivity into heroism. But for the survivors of Sandakan, there would be no hero's welcome. Their story would remain untold for years, even to loved ones.
Yes, I was married 24 hours to a good girl from Wallara, and away 5 years and didn't plan out when I came. She was there to me when I come back, and lasted for a little while, but it didn't plan out. My nerves was too bad, and I'm going to say it affected you terribly, you know, and just couldn't cope. So it wasn't her fault, it was my fault. But anyway.
When Richard Braithwaite returned home, he sought out the young wife of Wal Blatch, his close friend, who had died in Borneo.
I was happy for him to come, and I wanted to learn all I could, but actually couldn't really tell me anything because he only knew what had happened till the time he had dropped out and left the march. So nobody knows what happened to Wal after that, whether he perished in the jungle, whether he was shot, I don't know. And that's what loved ones are left wondering for years, really.
Eventually, Dick Braithwaite and Joyce were married.
I was a bit inclined to say, you know, you must be very special that you, one of 6 only, to have come out. And he hated anyone to say that. I'm not, he said. I shouldn't be here. He'd be thinking about all who didn't come back, who he'd say were far more deserving than I. He'd feel guilty that he was here and they weren't.
After weeks of questioning by military intelligence, Owen Campbell was finally allowed to fly home. During the war, his wife Evelyn had received a Red Cross letter to say Owen was believed dead, and she lived with this tragic news for over 3 years. On Owen's return, the authorities failed to contact her, and it was a newspaper reporter who finally told her that Owen was alive and recovering in hospital.
And Owen was sitting on the veranda, and that was the first I had seen of him since the day he left in the train.
Fantastic, you know, unbelievable. Especially when she walked down the veranda.
Bill Moxham became a soldier settler with land at Narrabri, New South Wales. But memories of Borneo were never far away. He called the property Ranau.
I know in my mind that, you know, he was tortured after the war. Coming back, he couldn't fit into civilian life. It was a war zone always for him. He'd crossed that barrier, crossed that line where he had ceased to be a civilised human being. I mean, I can remember him walking around the house calling out these Japanese generals' names or Japanese soldiers' names. And I can remember being in bed and my mother being attacked by my father for hours, and she screamed for me to get help. And there were share farmers down the end of our property. And I came to the door to try and get away, to get help. And my father was standing in front of the bedroom with a rifle pointed at my mother's head, and I just went back into the bedroom because I was so terrified. I suppose people repeat their experiences. Well, my father committed suicide around about 1960, 63, I think. He couldn't get back into an ordinary life again, I suspect. And so, until he died, he was a tortured soul.
Hundreds of letters sent to me, wanting to know about their fathers or brothers or husbands. So I wasn't allowed to forget about it.
The Japanese, I think, are the only race that shouldn't be in this country. I've got nothing against anybody else, but I'm going to say I don't think that the Japanese should be allowed into this country at all.
How can you forgive the Japanese? Never. Never forget and never forgive.
I hate them, and I always will hate them, and that's it. I'll never do anything to change my opinion of them.
Every year at the sacred town of Koyasan near Osaka, Japanese veterans of the Borneo campaign gather to honor those who lost their lives during World War II. Veterans like Umanosuke Iwahara, who took part in the first death march, come to remember fallen comrades. Families also visit Koyasan. Tetsuya Yamamoto, whose father led the first death march and was hanged as a war criminal, attends to learn more about his father's part in the war.
父が処刑をされたという通知が来た時にはそれは母と共に嘆き悲しんだんですけど、当時帰ってこられる方というのは父よりも階級の上のものというのはたくさんおられたはずなんです。それにどうしてうちの父が処刑されたのかということで。
Like many Japanese people, those who come to Koyasan are deeply divided over the issue of whether Japan should apologize for its wartime aggression and atrocities.
国は豊かになった、それからもう生活も豊かになった、だけど精神面ではまだその国際社会の中に入っていけるというふうになっていないように思います。やはりはっきりとその戦争の謝罪というのは必要だと思いますし、それは今の政府がやらないかんと思っております。
これに対してはね、各国に迷惑をかけた各国に謝罪をするというのは我々軍人はそれ不公平なそんなバカなことはということは大東亜戦は日本がやりたくてやったんではなくて。
They don't have to apologise to me. You've got to ask the relatives, does it mean anything to them? It wouldn't mean a thing to me if they apologised.
I don't think an apology to me, it just pouring water on a duck's back to me.
Over the last few years, successive Japanese prime ministers have struggled with the apology issue. The long-awaited speech from Prime Minister Murayama on VP Day expressed deep remorse and heartfelt apology, but was seen as a personal statement which did not reflect the views of the Japanese parliament or nation.
I mean, I've said this before, I don't think the apology matters as much as the inculcation of the ideas, the history and the values in their community.
How Japan deals with its past is finally a matter for Japan itself. An apology is meaningless if Japan is unwilling to change the way it understands and teaches its wartime history. At Koyasan, a stone tablet commemorates the Australian forces and the prisoners of war who died in Borneo. A small reminder for those who visit. It has taken many years for the full story of Sandakan to be heard in Australia. One day, the story may be told to a wider public in Japan.
Australian prisoners of war in any great detail. The truth, he believed, would cause such distress and anguish to the families of the prisoners that its telling should be postponed. We tell this story to ensure that what happened here
today was preserved at great cost, that the peace we have now was won with great suffering.
People are having the opportunity to be faced with some of these things, unresolved grief. It is really.
You train for things, for war, and you train for discipline. When you strike something like this, it brings home to you that you're like everybody else. You're human, and you're the same as everybody else. I don't think anybody that wasn't there would never actually believe half if you told them, they wouldn't believe you.
What went on there? How the hell that the men went through. No one will know. You couldn't tell them.
Just close your eyes. Remember them when you last saw them going away.